The first snow of winter fell on Skagen like ash from a funeral pyre, covering the longhouses in silent white that would not melt until spring. Ragnar Wolfheart stood in the doorway of his burning hall, watching flames consume everything his family had built across 4 generations, the heat blistering his face, while his hands hung useless at his sides. His wife Sigrid lay dead somewhere in that inferno, her body crushed beneath a fallen beam when the Danish raiders had set the roof ablaze. His 2 daughters, Yrsa and Helga, were gone, dragged screaming onto the dragon ships that even now disappeared into the fog-shrouded strait. Ragnar had fought like a madman, had killed 3 Danes with his bare hands after losing his sword, but there had been too many, always too many, and in the end he had been forced to choose between dying beside Sigrid or living to hunt the men who had stolen his children. He had chosen life, and that choice tasted like poison in his mouth. The village of Skagen had been small, barely 60 souls, too insignificant to warrant defences beyond a simple palisade that the Danes had burned through in minutes. The raid had come at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like wolves from a winter forest, their war cries shattering the peace before most villagers had even woken. Ragnar had been in his smithy, already at work on a new axe-head for Thorstein the fisherman, when he heard Sigrid scream. He had run toward their hall with the half-finished axe still glowing red in his hand, had used it to split the first Dane's skull before the metal had even cooled. But skill and fury meant nothing against 30 seasoned raiders who knew their business. They had taken the young women and the strong boys, killed anyone who resisted too effectively, burned what they couldn't carry, and vanished back into the sea fog like evil spirits returning to the underworld. Now Ragnar stood alone among the ruins, surrounded by bodies and smoke, and the soft whisper of falling snow. Of the 60 villagers, perhaps 20 remained alive, huddled in the smoking wreckage of their homes, tending wounds and counting losses. They looked to Ragnar with empty eyes, waiting for him to tell them what to do, how to respond, but he had no words for them. His entire world had collapsed in the space of a single morning. His wife was dead. His daughters were slaves if they still lived at all. Everything he had worked for, every careful plan for the future, every dream of seeing Yrsa and Helga married to good men and raising children of their own, all of it was ashes now, scattered on the wind like the snow that would not stop falling. Thorstein found him there as the sun climbed toward noon, still standing in the doorway, still staring at nothing. The old fisherman had lost his son in the raid, a boy of 14 who had tried to fight and been gutted for his bravery. Thorstein's grief was written in the deep lines of his face, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "The Jarl's men are coming from Aalborg," he said quietly. "They will be here by nightfall. They will want to know what happened, who is responsible. You need to decide what you are going to do, Ragnar. The dead are dead, but your daughters might still live." The words broke through Ragnar's paralysis like a hammer through ice. Yrsa was 16, beautiful and strong, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn courage. Helga was 13, quieter and gentler, who loved to sing and could gentle the wildest horse with a whisper. The Danes would sell them at the slave markets in Hedeby or Dublin, would use them until they broke and then discard them like worn-out tools, unless Ragnar found them first. Unless he became the thing he had always feared becoming, a man with nothing left to lose, willing to walk through fire and blood and darkness to reclaim what had been stolen. He turned to Thorstein, and the old fisherman stepped back at what he saw in Ragnar's face. "I am going after them," Ragnar said, his voice raw as torn metal. "I am going to find the men who did this, and I am going to kill every last one of them, and I am going to bring my daughters home. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. I will cross the whale road to the ends of the earth if I have to, but I will not stop until they are free, or I am dead." Thorstein nodded slowly. "Then you will need a ship, and you will need men willing to sail with you into certain death, because that is what you are offering." The Danes who did this were professionals, slave traders who know every trick and every hiding place between here and Miklagard. Hunting them will take months, maybe years. Most men cannot afford that kind of time. "Then I will go alone," Ragnar said. "You will die alone," Thorstein corrected, "and your daughters will still be slaves." "Think, Ragnar, Use the rage, don't let it use you. You need allies. You need information. You need to be smart about this, or all you will accomplish is adding your corpse to the pile. The Jarl's men arrived that evening, 20 mounted warriors led by a grim-faced herser named Knut, who surveyed the destruction with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many burned villages. He questioned the survivors, examined the bodies, studied the tracks leading back to the shore. When he had gathered all the information there was to gather, he found Ragnar sitting beside the cold forge, where Sigrid's body lay wrapped in what remained of their wedding blanket. Knut spoke without preamble. The men who did this are Harald Bluetooth's raiders, out of Jelling. They have been working this coast for 3 years, taking slaves to sell in the Frankish kingdoms. Fast, efficient, ruthless, they strike settlements too small to have proper defenses, take what they want, and disappear before anyone can respond. The Jarl has been hunting them for months, but they know these waters better than we do. Ragnar looked up at Knut, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Will the Jarl pursue them now? Will he help me get my daughters back? Knut's expression softened with something that might have been pity. The Jarl will send word to his allies, will make inquiries at the slave markets, will do what he can, but he cannot declare war on Harald Bluetooth over 20 slaves from a fishing village. The political cost would be too high. I am sorry, Ragnar. I truly am. But you need to understand that your daughters are gone, and the chances of recovering them are almost nothing. The kindest thing I can tell you is to pray that they were bought by decent masters, that they will be treated well, that they will find some measure of peace in their new lives. No, the word came out flat and absolute. No, I will not accept that. I will not leave them to that fate. Knut sighed. Then you are choosing a path of suffering that will break you long before it brings you any satisfaction. But I can see that nothing I say will change your mind. So instead I will tell you this. There is a trader in Repay, a man named Orm the Far-Travelled, who deals in information as well as goods. If anyone knows where Harald's raiders take their slaves, it will be Orm. Find him, pay him whatever he asks, and may the gods have mercy on you, because the world will not. Ragnar buried Sigrid the next morning, laying her to rest in the small graveyard behind what had been their home. He spoke no prayers, offered no fine words. There were no words adequate to the moment, no ritual that could capture what he felt. He simply covered her grave with stones to keep the wolves away, and promised her ghost that he would bring their daughters home or die trying. Then he took what few possessions he had left, the clothes on his back and his father's sword and every scrap of silver he had saved across 20 years of smithwork, and walked away from Skagen without looking back. The journey to Repay took 5 days through country turning white with winter. Ragnar travelled alone, sleeping in abandoned barns and beneath overturned boats, eating sparingly from the dried fish and hard bread he carried. He spoke to no one, avoided settlements, moved like a ghost through a world that had stopped making sense. At night, when he closed his eyes, he saw Ursa and Helga as they had been the morning of the raid, laughing together as they prepared breakfast, arguing over who would feed the chickens. He heard their screams as the Danes dragged them away, heard Sigrid calling his name as the burning roof came down. Repay was a bustling trading town, its harbour crowded with ships from a dozen kingdoms, its streets filled with merchants, hawking goods from as far away as the eastern deserts and the frozen lands beyond the midnight sun. Ragnar found Orm's warehouse near the waterfront, a massive timber structure guarded by 2 huge thralls who looked like they could break a man in half without effort. He told them he needed to see Orm on urgent business. They looked him up and down, saw a burned man with haunted eyes and a sword he barely remembered to carry, and almost turned him away. But something in Ragnar's face must have convinced them he was dangerous enough to be taken seriously, because they let him pass. Orm the Far-Travelled was a fat man with clever eyes and fingers, heavy with silver rings. He sat behind a table piled with tablets and scrolls, surrounded by the wealth of nations, and studied Ragnar with the expression of someone evaluating merchandise. "You have the look of a man who has lost everything," Orm said without greeting, "and the smell of smoke and death. What do you want from me that you think I can provide?" Ragnar laid his silver on the table, every coin and ring he possessed, a small fortune by the standards of a village smith, but barely worth noticing to a man like Orm. "Information," Ragnar said. "Harald Bluetooth's slave raiders hit Skagen 6 days ago. They took my daughters. I need to know where they take their captives, who buys them, how I can find them." Orm glanced at the silver, then back at Ragnar. "That is not enough to buy what you are asking for. The information you want could get me killed if Harald learns I sold it. Besides, by the time you find your daughters, they will already be sold, probably to different buyers in different kingdoms. The trail will be cold. You are chasing smoke. Then tell me how to make it enough," Ragnar said, his voice steady despite the desperation clawing at his chest. "Tell me what you need, and I will get it for you. I am a master smith. I can make you weapons, tools, whatever you want. I can work off the debt. Just give me something to go on. A name, a place, anything." Wormrat leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his multiple chins, calculating. "You are serious about this, serious enough to be useful, perhaps. Very well, I will tell you what I know, and in exchange you will owe me a favor to be called in at a time of my choosing. This is not negotiable. You want the information, you accept my terms." Ragnar hesitated. An open-ended debt to a man like Orm could mean anything, could bind him to tasks he would rather die than perform. But he had no choice, no leverage, no other options. "Agreed," he said. Orm smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Harald's raiders sell most of their slaves in Hedeby to a broker named Sven Redhand. Sven is particular about his stock. He takes the young, the attractive, the ones who will bring premium prices in the Frankish kingdoms or the eastern markets. Your daughters, if they were worth taking, will have passed through his hands within the last week, but Sven keeps no records. He moves his merchandise quickly, and once they are sold, they vanish into the world like raindrops into the ocean. However," Orm paused, letting the word hang, "there is a woman in Hedeby, a freed thrall named Astrid, who works in the market. She sees everything, hears everything, forgets nothing. If your daughters were sold there, she will know. Find Astrid. Tell her Orm sent you, and remember, you owe me." Hedeby was 3 days' hard travel from Ribby, and Ragnar made the journey in a blur of exhaustion and single-minded focus. The town was larger than Ribby, grimmer and harder, built around the business of buying and selling human flesh as much as any other commodity. Ragnar arrived at the slave market as the sun was setting, found it a maze of pens and platforms where men and women and children stood chained and hopeless, their eyes empty of everything but fear. He searched for Astrid among the crowds, asking questions, following directions, until he found her in a small stall selling bread to the slave handlers. She was perhaps 40 winters old, her face scarred and weathered, but her eyes sharp with intelligence. When Ragnar mentioned Orm's name, she pulled him aside into the shadows behind her stall. "You are hunting someone," she said. It was not a question. "Recent captives. Let me guess. Family. The desperate ones are always family." "My daughters," Ragnar said, 16 and 13, taken from Skagen 6 days ago. Blonde, both of them. Green eyes. Yrsa is tall, strong. Helga is smaller, gentle. "Please, if you saw them, if you know anything." Astrid's expression softened slightly. "I saw them 3 days ago. Sven Redhand brought them through with a batch of 15 others. They were frightened but unharmed. Sven was pleased with them, said they would fetch good prices. He sold them yesterday morning." She paused, watching Ragnar's face crumble. "They were bought together, which is unusual. A Frankish merchant named Theobald, who trades in high-quality slaves for noble households. He left yesterday afternoon, heading west toward Frisia. If you move fast, if you are very lucky, you might catch him before he reaches the coast. But I warn you, Theobald travels with guards, and he will not give up valuable merchandise just because a desperate father asks nicely." Ragnar left Hedeby within the hour, following the western road at a pace that would have killed a lesser man. He ran when he could, walked when he had to, stopped only when his body simply refused to go further. He caught up to Theobald's caravan 2 days later, on a muddy road winding through Danish farmland. The merchant travelled with 4 armed guards and a wagon full of chained slaves, moving slowly, in no particular hurry. Ragnar watched from the tree line, studying the situation, knowing that a direct attack would be suicide. He waited until nightfall, until the caravan made camp in a clearing beside a stream. The guards posted watches, but they were complacent, comfortable, used to traveling through civilized lands where bandits were rare. Ragnar moved through the darkness like a hunting wolf, silent and patient, until he was close enough to see the slave wagon. There, huddled together beneath a canvas cover, were Yrsa and Helga, their faces pale in the moonlight, their wrists raw from the iron manacles that bound them. Ragnar's heart nearly broke at the sight of them. They were alive, they were close enough to touch. But between them and freedom stood 4 warriors and a merchant, who would raise an alarm if he so much as sneezed. He needed a plan, needed to think clearly, but all he could feel was the overwhelming urge to charge in and damn the consequences. He was tensing to do exactly that when a hand clamped over his mouth from behind and a knife pressed against his throat. "Move and you die," a voice whispered in his ear, low and female and utterly calm. Ragnar froze. The knife stayed pressed against his throat while the hand released his mouth. "Turn around slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Ragnar turned to find himself facing a woman, perhaps his own age, lean and hard-muscled, dressed in dark traveling clothes, with a face that had seen violence and learned to return it with interest. She studied him with cold grey eyes, taking in his desperation and his weapons and his obvious intentions. "You are here for the slaves," she said quietly. "Family, my daughters," Ragnar breathed, "the 2 blonde girls. Please, I have been hunting them for 10 days. I have lost everything. They are all I have left." The woman considered him for a long moment. Then she lowered the knife fractionally. "My name is Thyra. I am hunting Theobald for different reasons, but our interests may align. He bought my sister from Sven Red Hand 2 weeks ago. She is in that wagon as well. I have been following him since Hedeby, waiting for the right moment to strike. 1 person attacking that camp is suicide. 2 people have a chance. Help me free my sister, and I will help you free your daughters." They struck an hour before dawn, when the guards were at their drowsiest. Thyra moved like smoke, cutting the throat of the first watchman before he could cry out, while Ragnar took the second with his father's sword, the blade sliding between ribs with the precision born of hundreds of hours at the forge. The 3rd guard woke and reached for his weapon, but Thyra's knife found his eye before he could shout. The 4th managed to scramble to his feet, managed to open his mouth to scream, and Ragnar's sword took his head off in a single stroke. Theobald emerged from his tent, terror painted across his soft merchant's face, and Ragnar grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off his feet. "The keys to the slave wagon," Ragnar snarled. "Now." The merchant produced the keys with trembling hands. Ragnar threw him aside and ran to the wagon, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. Then the chains fell away, and Yrsa and Helga were in his arms, sobbing against his chest, and Ragnar held them like he would never let go, held them while the world dissolved into tears and relief, and the overwhelming knowledge that sometimes, against all odds, prayers were answered. Thyra freed her sister, a girl barely older than Yrsa, and the other slaves as well, sending them scattering into the pre-dawn darkness with whispered instructions to run and not look back. Then she turned to Ragnar and his daughters. "We need to move. When Theobald's people discover what happened here, they will send hunters. We cannot stay in Danish territory." They traveled south and west, 4 fugitives moving through a hostile world, living on what they could scavenge or steal, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings. Thyra proved to be a capable guide and a deadly fighter, someone who had learned to survive in the margins of civilization. She and Ragnar shared their stories around cold campfires, trading horrors like currency. Thyra's sister had been taken from their village in Norway 6 months ago. Thyra had sold everything she owned, had learned to kill, had tracked the slave traders across half of Denmark before finding her target. Now they were both free, but freedom meant little when there was nowhere safe to return to. They reached Frisia after 2 weeks of hard travel, found passage on a merchant ship heading north, paid for their berths with the silver Ragnar had taken from Theobald's corpse. The ship dropped them on the Norwegian coast, and from there they made their way slowly back toward what remained of their lives. Thyra and her sister departed at a crossroads, heading toward relatives in the mountains, but before she left, Thyra embraced Ragnar like a brother. "You fought well," she said. "Your daughters should be proud of you. May the gods grant you peace." Ragnar returned to Skagen to find it half abandoned, the survivors having scattered to find shelter with relatives in other villages. Thorstein remained, old and stubborn, tending the graves and keeping watch over the ruins. When he saw Ragnar approaching with Yrsa and Helga, the old fisherman wept openly, something Ragnar had never seen him do. "A miracle," Thorstein whispered. "The gods have shown mercy." But the village was dead, and there was nothing left to rebuild. Ragnar took his daughters and what few possessions they could salvage and travelled to Aalborg, where the Jarl granted them a small plot of land in exchange for Ragnar's skills as a smith. They built a new home there, modest but sturdy, and slowly, painfully, began to construct new lives from the wreckage of the old. Yrsa never fully recovered from her captivity. She woke screaming from nightmares, flinched at unexpected sounds, could not bear to be touched by men she did not know. But she was alive, and she was strong, and over time the nightmares came less frequently. She married eventually to a quiet carpenter named Leif, who understood her damage and loved her anyway, and gave Ragnar grandchildren who would never know the terror she had endured. Helga was gentler, seemed less scarred, but Ragnar knew the wounds were there, hidden beneath the surface. She never married, chose instead to dedicate herself to healing, learning the arts of the herb wife, and helping others who had suffered as she had suffered. She became known throughout the region for her skill and her kindness, and Ragnar was proud of her in ways he could never adequately express. The favor Orm had demanded came due 3 years after the rescue. A messenger arrived at Ragnar's forge with a sealed letter, and inside was a single instruction: "Travel to Rebel, bring your best work." Ragnar went, his stomach tight with dread, and found Orm much as he had left him, fat and calculating and dangerous. The merchant wanted a sword, the finest Ragnar had ever made, a weapon worthy of a king. Ragnar worked for 3 months, pouring everything he knew into the blade, folding the steel 100 times, etching runes of power and protection into the fuller, wrapping the grip in leather taken from a bull he had raised and slaughtered himself. When he presented the finished sword to Orm, the merchant smiled his cold smile and pronounced the debt paid. Ragnar never learned who Orm gave that sword to, or what it was used for. He tried not to think about it, tried to believe that the price he had paid was worth the daughters he had saved. Most days he succeeded. He grew old in Aalborg, his hair turning white, his hands developing the tremor that eventually forced him to give up the forge. Sigrid's ghost never left him, but he made peace with her memory, spoke to her in the quiet hours of the morning, told her about their daughters and their grandchildren, promised her that he had done his best with what remained. He carved a memorial stone for her and placed it in the small garden behind his house, a place where he could sit and remember the life they had built before it was torn away. The night before he died, very old and ready to go, Yrsa and Helga sat with him, holding his hands as he had once held theirs in that slave wagon so long ago. He told them he loved them, told them he was proud of them, told them that saving them had been the only thing in his life that had mattered more than survival. They wept when he passed, but they did not weep as people who had lost everything. They wept as people who had been given a second chance, who had survived horror and built something beautiful in its wake. Ragnar Wolfheart was buried on a hill overlooking the sea, his father's sword at his side, with a view of the endless horizon that had once carried away everything he loved, and then, against all reason, brought some of it back.